Well, I am having a great time diving into all of these particulars and trying to understand the world through all of these different lenses. But ultimately, I guess I'm curious what you believe your model does really well, or what it is about the way that you view some of these issues that you might recommend to others.
Sure. So I think what the medical model does really well is sort of what I've been alluding to, which is solving problems.
Hmm.
And what that really comes down to is, I think, taking care of the wellness of the individual. And so when we talk about all of this trans care in the framework of the medical model, the goal is always patient centered. So the goal is not primarily to affirm the gender of the to affirm the gender identity. It's to do what's best for the individual that's in front of
Mm-hmm.
us, right? And so that's sort of the guiding principle, and I think that that corresponds with what I think is the basis of secular morality. Trying to improve the lives of humans, reduce suffering, and I think that that's the best thing. And I think that, in contrast to some other models, again, we're going to be a little bit more humanistic. You can correct me, Christy. My sort of perception is that some of these other models might put the identity at the center, and the sort of veneration of the identity, um, or the support of the identity itself at the center of the model, rather than the individuals who might um, uh, claim to have that identity themselves. What
Yeah,
do you think
I'm
about
sorry.
that?
Can you say that again? Walk me through what you're asking.
Sure. So I guess my question, because I might have this wrong,
Hmm.
my question is that, do some of these other models, do they put the individual, so in this case the trans individual, at the center of them, or do they put the identity itself at the center?
Mm.
Like, is it more important to these models to affirm, transgender identities, or is it more important to support the individual people?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. As a therapist, I suppose I tend to approach things from a very individualistic point of view. I have gotten a lot of flack for it before, but I often will say on this show that if there are 7.75 billion people on the planet, then we've got 7.75 billion different genders, that everybody is unique in that way, but for practical reasons we tend to group people together. And I don't see an issue with that. Just existentially it makes
Hmm.
sense to me that all of these models that we're using, all of these boxes that we are creating, are just intellectual framework, and are
Hmm.
totally made up, and essentially, if not completely arbitrary, at least somewhat based on our imagination more than anything else.
Right.
There
Yeah.
is real value in taking a more like sociological standpoint, but I hope that that is always from a descriptive rather than like a prescriptive sense, that we never tell people, well, you are this gender, therefore you must act or behave or look in this way.
Hmm.
And instead people will come to us and say, here is a adjective, here is a word, here is, if we really want to break it down, here is a sound or a vibration frequency that you can make with your vocal folds in order to describe me.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I again largely agree. I think, to your point, the way that society has understood gender has been mostly a pragmatic, a convenience
Hmm.
framework, right? Um, and when you get away from that sort of framework, you lose, and like as you were describing at the end there, a certain frequency or a certain vibration with your vocal folds, you start to wonder, well, what does that mean? And people, I think, in public don't know how to understand what that means, right? And so, yeah, I agree. Of course, I think that there's a huge diversity of gender identity, and and I think what I mentioned on the Truth Wanted is, I only really fundamentally care if it's causing you distress,
In order
right?
for something to be a problem, it has to cause an issue.
Right, exactly. And again, approaching it from the medical perspective, you can call yourself whatever gender you want. It doesn't really make a difference to me, uh, as long as like it only matters to me to the point that it affects your wellness, your health,
Mm-hmm.
and the care that I have to provide. Um, so, like, I can give you an example. I once treated a trans man who came in with appendicitis, and the only reason that I needed to know that they were trans is because I needed to know that they had ovaries, because appendicitis can affect the ovaries. And I had to say, when I was having my discussion, now there's a possibility that your ovary might be involved, and we might need to remove the ovary to make sure we get all of the infection out. And that's about it, right? Like I did the rest of their
There's not
gender
a moral
identity.
component to any of these things, just a very
Exactly.
practical need to understand, are we working with a testy, or what are we
Exactly.
working with?
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, that's about as far as it goes for from a medical standpoint and from the medical model. Uh, like you said, if it's not causing a problem, then it's not an issue.
So ultimately, then, is it fair for us to boil this entire conversation down to a question around whether gender nonconcordance is a pathology, or whether distress is necessary for transgenderism to exist, or
Mhm.
how should we be thinking about these things?
Yeah, so this I think is a good opportunity for me to bring up what I was alluding to at the beginning, which is how I think the understanding of medicine and disease has evolved. And I hope this isn't too heady or too off topic, but I think that we have generally begun to understand that basically, like almost every medical condition, every medical illness that you would classically think about exists on a spectrum. And again, we have historically seen only the most severe and distressing forms of that because they're the ones that show up. There's a lot of cases, say, for instance, of like a common cold that people don't even know that they have and they transmit, right? And it goes around in a population, but no one ever knows about it because it doesn't cause any problems. So, does that exist as a disease? Well, we would probably say no, because it's not causing distress, it's not causing dis-ease. Um, but if that same process, that same, biological process, that same pathology persists and gets worse to a certain degree, then we would call it an illness or a disease because it's causing dis-ease. And so in the same way, I think that this notion of like gender dysphoria, transgenderism, as we've been calling it, exists on a spectrum. And I think that a lot of people are, this underlying whatever component it is, mental, psychosocial interaction, exists to different degrees in the population. And the most distressing ones present as gender dysphoria. And then we have to treat them medically. But there's a whole swath of people who have transgenderism to some degree that that we never see. And there's, it's not like that underlying process isn't ongoing. So I would say that it still exists without being a disease. It's just that when it crosses a certain boundary that it starts to cause distress, that's when it becomes a disease.
Sure, and that's when the medical establishment steps in.
Hmm.
Uh, but I think it raises sort of a interesting thought experiment as to whether or not, in some hypothetical utopian society, people would experience being transgender at all, or if folks that we currently describe as transgender and will often, not prescriptively or not in a like mandatory fashion, but folks that we currently offer things like hormone replacement therapies and things like gender confirmation surgeries, in some sort of utopian society, would those be necessary? would it be possible for somebody to be born with testes and a penis and identify as a woman without any type of medical intervention? And is it right for us to maybe see that as a need?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I was talking with one of my friends who is a psychiatrist and deals with a lot of trans patients about this. And his suspicion is that there are people who are trans who don't feel distress about it. They have that identity, and it is the things that they feel they need to do are expressed in ways that don't require medical intervention. And like some of the things that he described are like transvestitism is potentially an expression of an underlying, inclination towards towards the opposite gender role, without being a full, sort of a full blown transgender, or these people who identify as being gender fluid. Obviously, they exist somewhere in between, or they go back and forth, and that is often subclinical as well, right? And so I think, again, these people I think exist, and your question is interesting. What would happen to these people in an ideal society? I would hope that ideally the societal pressure to conform would be gone, and therefore they would not feel any need to, or any distress, because they're not conforming with any gender norms. But I think really what that means is the ultimate like abolishment of gender in the way that we understand it socially now, right? What you would really, I think, then be looking at is the society where the question of gender sort of doesn't mean anything, right? It's like everyone is just who they are, and we'd almost see gender in the same way that you would see someone's name. It's like, well, yeah, I'm MD and you're Christy, and I don't understand what more you could want.
Why we have to box it up?
Yeah.
Which, if you live in a society which the vast majority, what I mean to say is the vast majority of human history, most human beings have known what, somewhere between like 25 and maybe 100 other human beings.
Right.
And so when you don't have to conceptualize, thousands of like random interactions with strangers, hundreds of celebrities, and dozens upon dozens of acquaintances and friends and everything else, perhaps it would be a lot easier, and you wouldn't necessarily need these broad categories. I want to be really careful when we talk about evolutionary psychology or try to impose our 2022 conceptualizations on primitive or ancient humans, but perhaps gender wasn't relevant in that kind of sense.
Yeah. And you wonder what a society would look like if they didn't have gender. And I wish I knew more about like Two-Spirit as a gender identity and how that fits into those Native American societies and social groups, right? And it seems like that's sort of an expression of this spectrum. There's people who fulfill both gender roles or identify with both gender roles to different, varying degrees. And I think that the existence of those independently in other, societies highlights the fact that there probably is this underlying, fact about humans that some of that really gender identity exists on a spectrum, and these buckets that we put, male, female, are really arbitrary, and again based on like statistical norms.
Yeah, so if that's the case, we spoke to student Dr. Ben a few months ago about our very loose, very weak, if I can call it that, our societal understanding of the biological underpinnings of gender. I know that there's no real answer to this question, but from your understanding and speaking very broadly, is there any medical consensus or reason for these different forms of gender expression?
So, I mean, I think a conversation like this would be incomplete without discussing the difference between sex and gender.
Sure.
And I think that, biological sex is something that we would probably agree is air quotes real, relating to genetics, genitalia, hormones, however you want to traditionally measure it in a scientific sense. And those different metrics may not always align with each other. Um, and that being very distinct from gender. And again, if we look at the DSM, what they define as gender is the public lived role as a boy or girl, man or woman. They specifically use that binary,
Hmm.
and considers the contribution of biological, psychological, and social factors. And so they're acknowledging that there's this confluence of multiple factors, some of which are internal, biological, and psychological, and then the interaction with the social element. And so I think that you could point to some genetically based characteristics as a trend, but I think it's one of those things where, you know, it's not like there's a single gene that codes for gender. It's like, scales, if you can imagine weights on scales, and the precise balance is a contribution of like hundreds or thousands or more genes probably, that contribute different things like hormones and development of reproductive organs and the way your brain is developed in utero and all these things, and your exposure to the environment. So, I mean, I think there's definitely a biological component. I think there's definitely an interaction with your environment, both social and like physical environment, that affects your gender. And I think that for the majority of people, they find themselves fitting comfortably into one gender, just because that's where the weight of those interactions, those all of those factors place them. But that's certainly not the case for everyone, and that's why we get this spectrum.
I love that we are diving into these unanswerable questions. I love exploring sort of the philosophy of gender while having these like very practical and medical underpinnings. The idea that my evangelical, bigoted dad could potentially stumble across this video and be absolutely like perplexed by everything that we've been discussing here just fascinates me and excites me. But ultimately, I guess I'm curious what sorts of changes you feel are appropriate or necessary, even for the way that the medical establishment understands gender or treats or offers care to people who are gender diverse.
So I think the biggest problem with the medical model as it stands today is this problem of like gatekeeping, and the fact that, and I think this is where a lot of our uh, perceived perhaps disagreement comes from, is the fact that in order for something to be considered extant in a medical model, it has to classify itself as a disease, which means checking some boxes, right? So I think there are problems with gatekeeping,
Mhm.
where we say, well, if you want to get hormone therapy, then you have to go and have a psychiatric assessment, and that can be very traumatic in itself, and very invasive, certainly. Um, and there are problems with that because it prevents people from accessing care. And I think physicians and psychiatrists have, um, physicians are, or psychiatrists are physicians, I should be clear.
Sure.
Uh, they have the best interests of patients in general at heart, because they want to make sure that a person fits into this category, because they know that's how they know that this treatment is going to work, right? But we also have to recognize that that presents a barrier to getting people the care that they need, right? If they never present to your office because they're afraid to undergo that invasive discussion, then you're not going to be able to help them. And so we're failing this invisible population of patients who never present because of the barriers that we put up. And so I think that's a design problem with the way that our medical system works. I think that the barrier is coming from the right place. And I think that the barrier is, that need to assess a patient in order to make sure that we're doing the right thing is still necessary. I don't think that we need to be opening a place where people can just walk in and say, give me hormones. I don't want to hear any other questions. I don't think that's the right way to go.
Sure.
But I think that some form of assessment is necessary, and it needs to be less intimidating and more accessible than it is now.
And it's very tricky. I've actually, I'll admit, rationally or irrationally, I've lost a little bit of sleep after recommending on this show a specific app that is pretty comparable to Roman, if folks are familiar with that. Roman is a way of receiving erectile dysfunction meds, as well as like a small handful of other things, more or less anonymously online. Theoretically, there is a interaction or a prescribing physician that is like signing off on all of this, but it's done in the least gatekeepingest way imaginable. And I only reference Roman because there is a very similar program that's called Mariposa that offers hormone replacement therapies online. And I have very mixed feelings about it, because the reality is I work with a number of transgender folks that for very, very valid reasons have complex trauma related to the medical establishment, and they need medical care. And I cannot stress, I don't think this is shocking to you, MD, but I cannot stress to the audience enough how much very real fear there is in the transgender community with regards to the medical establishment. I certainly don't speak for that community, and I don't want to oversimplify things or paint with too broad a brush, but it's near universal, the distress that has been caused by interactions with the medical establishment. And I understand where that is coming from, and I don't love the opposite version where it's just buy whatever you want carelessly and casually. But this is a very complex issue.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, the flip side is that no treatment is benign, period, right?
Sure.
Like every treatment has side effects, including hormone therapy. But even to a greater extent, surgical treatments have a side effect profile that can be, potentially damaging to health. So, I mean, the very fact that, it's sort of a shame that the interventions that are required, the medical treatment that's required for some of these patients is potentially dangerous. And it requires, I think, if we're being responsible, interactions with a healthcare system that has lost the trust of the community. And it's something that we need to be working towards gaining back. But I think there's just no safe way to deliver that care without having this interaction in some form.
Sure. Well, outside of medicine, this is again another very big question. But what is it that you personally worry about with regards to the way our society understands these issues? What do you think that the average Joe maybe misunderstands about the biological or the medical aspects of gender?
Yeah, I think going back to the caller that we had on Truth Wanted is perhaps a good way to address this. So, James, I think a lot of people who are opposed to transgender initiatives in their various forms see it the same way that he does, in that trans people are making a statement of fact about their gender, and people perceive it as relating back to some physical thing that is real and provable and scientifically examinable. And I don't think that gender is. I don't think that we could ever, with our most intense brain scans, look at a brain and tell, yes, this person identifies as a male or female or whatever, right? We can tell things about biological sex, but I don't think that there's anything fundamental about anyone that can tell you their gender. And I think that that's the real misunderstanding that the average person has is they think that trans people are stating something that is objectively verifiable about themselves. And they're saying that, and in those people, the average person's mind, it's coming into conflict, right? So they're saying, no, you have a penis, and therefore that's a scientific fact. And therefore, the scientific fact that follows is that you must be a male.
You
And I
can't
think that,
identify as a dog or as a
right,
attack helicopter, and we start to
right.
get these old arguments.
Right, exactly. And so I think that what would be most useful for the average person is to try to understand gender in a less scientifically defined way and a less, air quotes, real way, as in something that you can examine externally and think of it more as like sort of what I was alluding to earlier, as like someone's name. It's something that they identify as, and it means something to them. And it may not mean something to you, but that doesn't really affect how you should interact with them. And like, it would seem absurd to discriminate against people because their name started with a G or their name started with a W or something, right? And so I think if we start to view people's expression of gender as a form of self-description, rather than a declaration of a scientific fact, then people would be a little bit, we get a little closer to understanding that maybe they're not saying the same thing that you think they're saying. And I would hope that that brings a little bit more understanding and patience to the average person. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I guess the only thing I might highlight is there could be some portion of the audience that heard you talk about, being less scientific, and might kind of get their hackles up over that idea. And I'll just say, in the like social sciences, we love to swim in these waters. We're very used to the idea of things being made up and real at the same time.
Mhm.
I've used this example on the show before, but by that metric, like, the United States of America is not real. It's a
Right.
social construct, right? Like, it's
Yeah,
just an idea that we've all agreed on. The
totally.
idea that money exists, that like little pieces of paper have value, is
Hmm.
just a social construct. It's a contract that we all agree to. And our gender is very real and very meaningful in a scientific sense. But
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily mean, at least in this day and age, that we can point to it on a like some sort of spectrograph or some sort of MRI or anything
Yeah.
else.
Or look at it under a microscope and identify it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And that's an interesting, you should come on Truth Wanted with me sometime, Christy, and we can talk about whether or not holes exist.
Oh man, fucking yeah. All right, let's do it. Let's do that. But before we wrap up here tonight, I guess I just wanted to ask if there were any particular organizations or political activism opportunities, any further reading or resources, or really anything on these subject matters that you might want to point people towards.
I think so. Like I said, I'm not an expert in this. I think that the best thing you can do is try to get informed and get informed in the best way that you can. And that, I think, means looking up some of the um, literature that's been published. And there is going to be literature for whatever um, your level of education and knowledge about the area is. And you can always get in. And if you just do a Google search, looking at a reputable, from some reputable agencies, um, then you'll find something that's at your level, and you can start there and just go wild, right? And so always getting more informed is where I would recommend. And unfortunately, I don't have any great organizations to plug, but I'm sure you do.
Sure. Well, yeah. If the goal here is just to become a little bit more aware, a little bit more informed of these issues, I have always enjoyed pointing people towards the book "How to Understand Your Gender" by John Ifanetti and Meg John Barker. It's a very simple, very easy read that exhaustively explores these topics, and definitely worth people's time. But I'm also very much of the opinion that these conversations are sort of ongoing. Like
Hmm.
culturally and socially, we are still figuring this shit out. As I pointed out, the American Psychological Association and the World Health Organization are kind of rapidly changing their understanding of these things as well. And so I definitely think there's value in keeping your finger on the pulse. Nobody expects you to know every detail of what is the like esoteric understanding of gender in the social and medical sciences and these types of things, but be engaged in the conversation. And for that reason, I am just so grateful to everybody who has stuck it out for this like very complex and maybe somewhat esoteric conversation. I know I've had a great time, and I super appreciate you being here. And this has just been really everything that I want to do on my Thursday night. So thank you so much for walking us through these ideas.
Well, yeah, it's been great for me too.